Good morning, everybody. It is Monday. It's after 8 o'clock in the morning. I am actually back in my hometown because today Robert and I are going to go get our marriage license, but I wanted to start off this reading vlog real quick with talking about what I'm going to be reading. I just posted, by the time this video is out, I will have just posted probably a couple days ago the video for my Phantom reading vlog for the Thirst series by Christopher Pike. Today I'm going to be starting off with Evil Thirst, which is book 5 in the series. So if you have not watched any of the videos previous to this in this reading series, please go watch those videos or read those books at the same time because I will be going into spoilery content. This is a reread series for me for those of you that have not been here with the series. I read this series first in high school and I really liked it at the time, and I decided to do a reread of it now as an adult. I figured I would like to see how my reading tastes may have changed, if they have at all, and if I like these books more as an adult or if I actually dislike them. And in the last video for Phantom, I found that so far has been my favorite book of the series. I rated it a 4-star, whereas the other 3 books in the series I had read up to that point were the first book, The Last Vampire, 2 stars, Black Blood, the second book, 2.5 stars, and Red Dice, the third book, 3 stars. So today I will be starting off, like I said, with Evil Thirst, which is book 5. So from here, I'm going to be talking about spoiler stuff. So if you do not want to be spoiled for anything that happens in the Thirst series, I would click away from this video. But if you have read the first 4 books, this is going to be probably no news to you, but I kind of wanted to do a recap in case there is any confusion about what happened in the last book. So in Phantom, basically we saw Sita, who was freshly turned into a human after having been a vampire for 5,000 years, and in the course of the book she finds Ray, who was her boyfriend that she had met in The Last Vampire and that we thought had supposedly died in Black Blood, and he comes back saying that he didn't actually die and that he was able to transform himself into a human after Sita had, and Sita then finds out she's pregnant with what she thinks is Ray's baby. We find out later that's not the case. The baby is actually the product of Sita and Arturo, who we had met in Red Dice, and he was the person who basically created the process by which Sita was able to become a human. We find out that in Red Dice at some point they had conceived a child, and at the time Sita was still a vampire, and so the baby therefore is also now a vampire. And Sita does give birth to her and names her Kalika, and she essentially is the reincarnated version of the Hindu goddess Kali Ma. And throughout the book we realize very quickly that Kalika is very evil. She basically is bloodthirsty, no pun intended considering she's a vampire, but she is hell-bent on essentially destroying the world in a sense. We don't know how, but we do know that there is another woman who is pregnant who's named Paula Ramirez, and apparently she had conceived her child under very mysterious circumstances where it seems either divine intervention was involved or possibly aliens is what she thinks. So we find out though that Kalika is obsessed with this baby, and so she wants to get a hold of it even though she doesn't know where the baby is. Okay, so first update of the day. It is about 11:30 in the morning. I've been sitting here at my parents' kitchen table doing some work because I had to still work today. Things did not go well this morning, but that's beside the point. Basically, we realized and found out that we didn't have to come all the way out here to get our marriage license because we should have applied for it in the county we live in. I read the first 2 chapters so far of Evil Thirst, so the only thing we know right now is the first chapter was basically doing a little bit of a recap on how things were going, and then Sita basically finds out that there is this kind of talk going on where this archaeologist is claiming he has found this text that predicted the birth of Paula Ramirez's son, who is supposedly the new version of Jesus Christ. He is kind of the reincarnated version of that, like I had predicted in the last book as what he was supposed to be. The archaeologist basically talks about how this text came from a woman named Suzima, who was from ancient Egypt, and Sita actually had known Suzuma and was a student of hers when she was a vampire back in ancient Egypt times, because if you know the story, you would know Sita has been around for over 5,000 years. She was originally from the more Indian area. She was what was called part of the Aryan race, which unfortunately that name has now kind of a negative connotation to it because of the Nazi regime. But back in the before Christ time, the Aryan race were kind of the fairer skinned individuals that lived in the Indian area. So this person, this archaeologist, is claiming that he has this text that Suzuma had created, but Sita's not really 100% sure if that's correct. But what this archaeologist claims is that the born again Christ is basically going to bring peace to the land, but there are a lot of people that are out to get him, a lot of dark forces, which that leaves Sita to believe that not only is Kalika after this child, but something possibly darker and more powerful, and she knows she has to go after Kalika and stop her from obtaining this child, because that child would be in danger. And there's a lot of other issues that go on with it, because if you remember, if you had read Phantom, you know that Kalika is essentially the reincarnated version of Kali Ma, which is a goddess from Hindu mythology that essentially is the destroyer of worlds. She's not necessarily like all bad. There is some thought to her as being also just kind of a death goddess, but she doesn't necessarily destroy everything. But there are aspects to her that she does bring about the end of time, essentially, which in Hindu mythology is called Kali Yuga, where the thought is that once Kali Yuga commences, that the world will basically be reshaped and Krishna will essentially come back, or in Christianity, in a sense, is the kind of end of days where Jesus Christ will come back. So there's a lot of like parallel and a lot of overlap between Hindu and Christian mythology and religious ideologies about kind of the end of time kind of thing. Basically, all I know now is that Sita in the second chapter, after she watches this lecture that this archaeologist goes through and get some questions answered about what this archaeologist knows about the text, she does meet him face to face, and they do agree to meet up so that she can see this text that he has. And she claims that she has another text of Suzuma's, but I don't believe that that's actually the case. I believe she's just bluffing just to be able to see the scripture and all this stuff. And I believe that it's supposed to help her try to figure out what exactly she needs to do in order to save this baby that is her friend's and is essentially kind of the born-again Christ, and then therefore how to stop Kalika and any other dark forces that may come into play in the story. So the only thing that really the synopsis on Goodreads for this particular book does go into is the fact that Sita does have to find a way to stop Kalika and stop her from basically destroying the world. That's pretty much all there is given. It doesn't talk anything about this archaeologist, so my thought is that it's only going to be used in the sense to bring up this character Suzuma, and really only be used as kind of like a starting off point. It's not like a really big point to where it's going to take over the entire story. But I do believe, if I remember correctly, this does go into a little bit about the relationship between Suzuma and Sita and what exactly happened, and therefore how does she find a way to stop Kalika. So that's all I know of so far. I've only read the first 2 chapters, like I said. And like I've said before, this particular copy I have is a bind up. This is a bind up of books 4, 5, and 6 in the series. So the page counts are not exactly accurate. What's interesting though is what I found out is that each of these books came out pretty much like boom, 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 like within a couple of months of each other. So this seems to have been like a serialized series where it's possible they could have all been put into like one thing, which is why I think they were made into omnibuses, where the first volume was the first 3 books. This is the second set of 3, because the time period between Phantom and Evil Thirst publications was about 2 months, like almost exactly 2 months. Phantom was published in May of 1996, and Evil Thirst was published in July of 1996. But yeah, so I just found that really interesting how these books seem to have come out really quick, and that's probably because they were so short and they kind of were serialized almost, where like you put them out quicker because they're so short, and that way you could get your readers more interested and purchase more copies basically that way, as opposed to having like one big book that was all three kind of thing, which I don't think that, you know, we see that anymore, other than like the novellas that we see from like Sean and McGuire with the Wayward Children series. I think that's the only series I know of off the top of my head that does something like that, because each novella is distinctly different, so it couldn't all go into one big story. The only other one I can think of is, it's one with Jesse Elliott and some other author. It's a dual authored story, and apparently there's like 4 parts to it that are all like 120 pages each. I heard Kate's Book Date talk about it a couple days ago, but I can't remember the name of it, but I'll leave the cover here of the first book. Hi guys, so obviously I'm home again now. It's about 10:45 in the morning. I am working again today until 5 because I didn't start work until almost 2 hours ago. It's been a day. I feel like I'm like a chicken with my head cut off. I'm trying to finish up Bill's stuff, you know, just because we're getting ready closer to the wedding and there's some stuff we still need to get. I need to get stuff for the bachelorette party, and trying to like balance all of this stuff and like, you know, make sure that we can pay our bills and stuff too. It's a little frustrating. As far as my reading progress, I read about 47 pages worth of Evil Thirst yesterday. I just didn't have a lot of time to read because I had to work, and then I was waiting on Robert for a while, so I did read in the evening, but then it was kind of, everything was crazy, and by the time we left my parents' house, it was dark, so I couldn't read in the car. So I didn't really have a lot of time to read, and then I was so exhausted when I got home. I like passed out and slept through the whole night, and then this morning I woke up about 7:30 and went to go get the marriage license taken care of. So haven't had a chance to read as of yet because I've just been feeling like I'm running around with, you know, no head, and I just, it's been crazy. But I don't have any meetings today, which means I can kind of just focus on work, and then when I get to take a break, be able to sit and read for a while and stretch my legs and all that good stuff. I haven't really made much more progress than what I've already told you. There's still not really a lot that's happened in terms of like anything, other than the fact that Sita has at this point gone to the place where she believes that Paula had conceived the baby. We are now in a flashback scene. I had to stop in the middle of a chapter, but there was like a break in the chapter, so it was fine. So now we're going into a flashback scene from Sita's past, 50 years after Krishna dies. So they're in kind of like a Kali Yuga, which is a dark age, which is basically any time that there is not a Christ-like figure in the world. So technically, I guess I was using the phrase Kali Yuga wrong the entire time I've been talking about this, so I apologize to those of you that, you know, are a little bit more well-versed in all of this stuff. Kali Yuga is apparently just a time where there is no Christ, there is no, you know, symbol of Christianity, essentially, no figure of Christianity to follow. So this happens, this is basically a flashback to when Suzuma and Sita meet for the first time, and I think that that's going to be a big part of this, is there's going to be more of a focus on Suzuma and her play in all of this, because she's the one that kind of like foretold the coming of Paula's baby, who was supposedly like the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. Good morning, everybody. It is 20 to 8 in the morning on Wednesday, October 21st. I've made small bits of progress through Evil Thirst at this point. I yesterday did not feel very well. I had to go get groceries, and afterwards I was just very like tired and my stomach hurt a little bit, so I didn't do a lot. I did do a little bit of reading after work though. I basically got through like 32 pages over the course of the day. It was just kind of a really kind of rundown day. I think just all the stress that's been going on recently, like finishing up stuff for the wedding, has been like really wearing me down like badly. But so far I'm at a point where Sita, or actually as her name is pronounced, Sita, which I'll go into here in a minute, she has at this point joined up with this archaeologist team that has this scripture from Suzuma, and they are basically trying to go after Kalika because she tells them about Kalika, but doesn't like reveal necessarily that Sita herself is like a vampire. Sorry if there's like some weird flashing and blinking and changing of clarity. I don't know what that's about. So basically they're trying to go after Kalika, but it's obviously being proven that she's a lot tougher than she looks, because she's a freaking reincarnated goddess. So that makes a lot of sense. So that's basically all I've got to at this point, which that seems to be pretty much the big part of the story. Is now we have this team that she's been kind of joining up with because they know about Suzuma, who was a character that Sita had known growing up, is a vampire growing up. She doesn't really know necessarily whether or not the scripture that they have is necessarily completely accurate. She knows that it definitely came from Suzuma, but she doesn't know how Suzuma created it, doesn't know how she really knew any of this kind of stuff. But it's interesting so far. I really like it. And it kind of goes into this point that I wanted to talk about, because what I've seen so far with both Phantom and Evil Thirst, and even a little bit here and there over the course of the rest of the books, is this increase in the Hindu mythology and the Hindu references to religious texts and things of that nature. And I remember that being like a pretty big part of it when I was growing up, but I didn't remember exactly to the extent of how much was involved in the book. And I feel like I have learned a lot from this. And I remember stating in my first review of The Last Vampire, where I kind of talked about it pretty negatively, where I wasn't really 100% certain if any of the stuff involved in the series was actually accurate, if it actually was taken from Hindu stories and mythology and all of that, and like religious ideas. And thankfully, one of you guys, one of the viewers of that video, left me some amazing information, because they have studied Hindu stories and actually had read the series themselves when they were younger, and it got them interested in learning about religion and philosophy and all these different things. So the person I wanted to read off these comments because since it deals with the content of the story and helping to understand it a little bit more, I thought it would be really interesting for you guys if you haven't seen that video or seen that comment. This is from Jedi0424, and the first comment they left on the video was in reference to my thought about the fact that I thought I might need to go read up more on Hinduism and specifically the mythology. And they recommended me basically saying that reading up on Hinduism will help, specifically the Bhagavad Gita, which I have heard many times. I've heard of that through my Buddhism research that I have done, which Buddhism and Hinduism are very different things, but they kind of like ran around with each other, because Buddhism was started in kind of the Indian region for a long time and then spread out to like China, Japan, Thailand. Hinduism is kind of like, it takes a lot of the inspiration from Buddhism, but it is its own kind of mythology, its own religion. It has its own kind of set of ideas, but from what I understand, it kind of does draw on a lot of the Buddhist kinds of ideas, which is really interesting if you're ever interested in looking into it. And then they gave the actual pronunciation of Sita's name, which is Sita, not Sita, like I was saying before. It's more of an E sound as opposed to an I. And apparently Sita is actually a central character in Hindu mythology in an epic called the Ramayana, which I've also heard, because funny enough, when I was in college, I was taking a theater history class, and that semester that I was taking it, which was my last semester of college, we had a visiting professor from India who was teaching over the semester. Basically, I believe it was more like Indian history in theater and just in kind of in general, like the performative history of India. And I believe he had talked a little bit about the Ramayana and how that was an epic that was like performed and spoken and traditionally passed down kind of thing. Then they go into talking about the Christianized version of Krishna, because I kind of described like this story as having what I thought to be a Christianized version, because I saw a lot of parallels between how Krishna is described in the story and how Jesus Christ has typically been described in like contemporary kind of society kind of thing. And they said that there is kind of some idea of like there being a Christianized version of Krishna, because apparently there is a discipline in Hinduism called bhakti, which means devotion, and it is where a believer can receive blessing by simply submitting to Krishna, which is kind of the idea that is behind Christianity. If you submit yourself to Christ and you kind of do as he bids in a sense, and you just devote yourself to him as opposed to like focusing on yourself or focusing on what you think is best kind of thing, then you will then therefore be blessed, which Sita kind of does. She submits herself to Krishna in order to try to be blessed, because she doesn't want to be a vampire. She doesn't think that it's a great thing. And so Krishna then gives her, says that basically if she does what Krishna has asked of her, that she will then receive his blessing, kind of thing, kind of that going back to that devotion kind of thing. Apparently though, this does stand in contrast to the way that the disciplines of knowledge, or jnana, and action, dharma, are alternate paths to enlightenment. So basically this idea of devotion is kind of like a third path of enlightenment. The knowledge is kind of like gaining the knowledge of like the beliefs and all these things, and then action is like actually doing things to showcase your devotion, your beliefs, that kind of thing. And those are like three ways to obtain enlightenment, which again goes back to this whole thing with Buddhism, because Buddhism was a whole religion and philosophy based on the idea of wanting to obtain enlightenment. And so many people might know Buddhism was also kind of like this thing where, you know, based on my research, that the Buddha basically like did a lot of things where, you know, he went without things. He, you know, a lot of people talk about how Buddhists are kind of very minimalistic, and how a lot of times they don't really have a lot of material things because they are trying to obtain enlightenment, which enlightenment to them at the time, centuries ago, before Christianity was ever a thing, I believe, they basically like thought of the idea that you don't need much to go on, because a lot of things that are in life are suffering, and if you remove yourself from those things, you will then no longer suffer, and then you will therefore obtain enlightenment, which this is where Hinduism kind of gets that, because like I said, Hinduism kind of drew off of a lot of, I believe, the Buddhist texts. If I'm wrong, somebody please correct me, but I thought that was what I had read. I could have misinterpreted that, so please feel free to contradict me and educate me a little bit further down in the comments below if you believe anything I've said has actually like no standing or anything. So apparently though too, which makes a lot of sense considering that this book is heavy-handed with a lot of the Hindu themes and kind of like information regarding like the stories and everything. According to this comment too, Christopher Pike had a really big thing for Hindu themes. Like, and it's very obvious. You see throughout the whole story that he's implemented all these different things, which tells me that because it's all there and it all seems to kind of line up with what we know of Hinduism and the mythology, that he was a studier of it, he was a researcher of it, and he enjoyed learning about it. And I think that's really interesting, because that's actually something I had wanted to do for a long time, where I wanted to research Buddhism for a particular book to then implement it in a book and put it as a part of my world that I was going to have for a fantasy novel. I've since kind of tabled that idea. I've kind of like gone away from that, but I'm still actually enjoying the research of Buddhism kind of thing. So that actually makes me really happy to see. And apparently he is more specifically a huge fan of reincarnation, because I guess a lot of his books tend to focus on the ideas of like reincarnation, which is not just a Hinduism belief, it's also part of Buddhism. And I thanked this person, and then they basically gave me even more information on it, saying that basically they had started reading this books when they were about 12 years old, and it's what got them interested originally in religion, philosophy, theology, and it's what they eventually studied in university and in seminary. And basically they agreed with me that like in this video that it doesn't age well in particular, because there's a lot of like, you know, a lot of what they call cheese and trash. So it's very cheesy in some parts, very kind of trashy. But I will say that the books are getting better in terms of that, and I think that's because we're getting closer and closer to what we typically see in young adult and maybe even I would consider new adult literature. I would consider this to be kind of like on that cusp of young adult and new adult, because there's a lot of talk of sex, there's a lot of talk of violence and gore, and there's some pretty like intense scenes in terms of like literal limbs being like ripped off and stuff like that, and blood gushing everywhere, so it's a little violent too. And then they also recommend another book that Pike has written that deals with the ideas of reincarnation, which is Midnight Club. It gives kind of more of a look into Pike's obsession with it. They basically call it a 90s version of The Fault in Our Stars, which I know what The Fault in Our Stars is about. I've never read it, but that is interesting to me. I'm interested to see how that would go, because I think if I like this series enough by the end of it, I may go pick up more of his books, because I never read anything past Thirst. I know he has several series that came out over the course of the 90s and the early 2000s, but I never got into them. So I thought that was just a really cool comment to see. So thank you, Jedi0424, if you're watching this video, for leaving that comment on that video. That has really helped me to understand a lot more of what this story is going for. It puts a lot of faith, I think, back in the story too, because it seems to me that based on your comment that you believe Pike had like actually been a kind of researcher and was pulling from these stories he had researched and understood to throw into the story. And it might not necessarily all be completely accurate, but there is enough of a kind of kernel of truth to them that gives them kind of a almost believability, and it also kind of just gives a lot of background into what exactly the story is about, which is about a woman who is a vampire that is from this time, that has basically transcended time and comes from like this place of, you know, enlightenment that, you know, we are looking for. She's constantly looking for enlightenment and being able to finally die and reincarnate because she hates being a vampire, and she's constantly looking for this blessing from Krishna and constantly wanting to be in his grace because she has tried so hard to be good, considering the fact that she was turned into a vampire against her will. So I really like that. I definitely would like to go and read the Bhagavad Gita and the Ramayana based on both of these, but I feel like at the moment I'm gonna have to wait until I do some more research with Buddhism, because I want to finish up my research with that, and there may be some overlap. So that's basically it for right now. Next time I'll talk to you, because I spent so much time sitting here talking about one particular thing, is I'll just let you know when I get done with the book. I don't have much of it left. I think that I've like at least halfway through it. I'm currently on chapter 10, and the book is only like 18 chapters, I think. So I might be able to get it done today. It's going to depend on how today goes, but I'll let you guys know at the very least when this is finally done. All right. So let's talk about Evil Thirst. Evil Thirst, I think, was weird. And truthfully, one of the big other gripes I have with it is I feel like, truthfully, this is going to be one of those stories where it would have just been better if books 4 and 5 had been put together, because they work, you know, as a cohesive unit. They basically pick up almost right after each other. Evil Thirst does take place about 3 months after the events of Phantom, but basically the way that the story builds and the way that the story develops and eventually how it ends does make it seem like it could have easily have been a mashup between Phantom and Evil Thirst. However, knowing the history of this series, it doesn't surprise me that they made them into 2 separate stories, because, as I've said many times before, back in the 90s, it seems like books were no more than usually 200 pages, 250 pages. So this is a more serialized series. This is partially why I feel like the story didn't do as well for me, because I feel like it just would have been better to have combined Phantom and Evil Thirst, considering that they deal with the same thing. A certain plot line does end off in this book that I think is really important, that tied into a plot line developed within book 4. So, all right, vagueness out of the way, let's go into what this is about. Like I said before, Evil Thirst picks up about 3 months after the events of Phantom. At the end of Phantom, basically Seymour nearly died, and Sita had brought him back to life with the blood of the essentially newly born Christ that there is. Basically, this child that Sita's friend Paula had given birth to is like the reincarnation of Jesus Christ in some capacity, or Krishna, you know, one of the kind of more important religious figures basically in the entirety of time. And Sita is trying to find him, to protect him, because her daughter Kalika is still after him. And in this book, we learn a lot about a particular moment of Sita's past that deals with a woman named Suzuma, who was basically the seer back in ancient Egypt. She was a seer, a prophet of sorts, a diviner. She was basically a lot of things. Like, she could read the stars, she could interpret dreams, she was able to see the future and certain visions of things, and she was well revered within this little area of Egypt called the Bowl of Flies. And we learn throughout these flashbacks of what happens to Sita while she's there, when she starts to learn how to harness her powers when it comes into meditation, and how she learns how to control her hunger with Suzuma. We learn of a character named Ori, who is this high priest. He works for the king, basically, or the pharaoh, and he is a part of a group called the Setians. And the Setians are basically, it's described in the story as kind of like a cult of sorts, a cult of bad people, essentially, and I'll get more into them when I get into the end part of the story, because there's a whole thing with them that I'm kind of like, my mind was blown with, that I don't think really, like, it's one of the big problems I had with what I remember of the end of the series, but I'll get into it in a second. So basically, the whole story is Sita and Seymour trying to find a way to find this baby, to protect him, because Kalika is after him, and there's a lot dealing with in the present time how Suzuma's scriptures that supposedly were written when Sita had known her have come up, and she gets involved with this group of people who are kind of like Suzuma's followers in a sense. They are kind of their own group following the scriptures that are there. They want to also then find this child and protect him, because they see in the scriptures that Suzuma dictates that there is somebody coming after him, there is a dark force that is coming, and also makes mention of Kalika as, possibly another dark force that could be coming after him, but there's other forces at play. And it also mentions how there is a particular other force that comes in that's not bad, that is meant to protect him, and Sita believes that is her because of the past events that have happened leading up to this point. So we basically get to a point where, after learning about the flashbacks, and Kalika goes after John and she kidnaps him, that they all go after her, and it turns out, like, the real big meat of the story, I feel like that there is at the end of the book. I feel like there's a lot of, like, stuff that got through the story that, had big meaty portions. Like, there was obviously learning about Suzuma and the scriptures, and then the next big meaty part was the end of the book, where we get to Kalika and learn basically that everything is not as it seems, because we find out that Kalika basically dies, unfortunately, and Kalika, before she dies, saves her own mother's life by giving her her blood and telling her that Kalika wasn't really supposed to be a bad guy. Kalika was actually trying to protect the child because she knew about the Setians and that they were behind what was going on, leading into this point that there's a character that was a part of this group following Suzuma named James, who we find out is not who he says he is, and he's actually like pretty much I wouldn't say a reincarnation, because he's not a reincarnation, but the character Ori that I mentioned earlier, who was like this leader of the Setians on Earth, he disguised himself and is the one that is after this baby and tries to kill Sita, almost does, kills Kalika, kills off this man that, he was posing as his son, and nearly kills Seymour once again, which then also, we find out, leads to Seymour finally becoming a vampire like he's always wanted. 5 books in, we finally get Seymour to become a vampire, which is interesting. And then the very last chapter of the book, we learn that there's some sci-fi elements going on into this story, which this was something I didn't remember happening this early in the series. So for those of you that might have been with me throughout the entirety of my reread series of this, you would know that I've talked extensively about how the very end of this series left me very, very confused when I had reached it when I first read the series in high school, because the ending of the story basically took this weird sci-fi turn I wasn't expecting. There was something about Sita going onto a ship and then basically dying, but also then at the same time, being reborn in some other world kind of thing. It was very weird, and it all took place in space. Sita goes after Ori to get the baby that they are naming for right now John. They don't really have a name for him, but he's being called John at the moment. Sita basically gets there and finds out that the Setians are basically like an alien race. They're an alien demon race of some kind. So it doesn't necessarily take like a full-on religious perspective of it just being a demon from like below the ground, but there's like a hell planet, and the Setians are basically aliens, and they're there to take the child because there's some kind of prophecy about, them eating the child and then them being able to take over the universe or something along those lines. It's not super clear. So yeah, apparently we have aliens going in on this story, and that was a big shock to me, and I don't like it. I did not like it from what I remembered in high school. It comes out of left field. Like, where the hell does somebody get the idea of the aliens being involved? I highly doubt this was something that was brought up in Hindu mythology. I really don't understand, but I'm not trying to discount it too much, because it is possible it could be some, thoughts about aliens in Hindu mythology that we don't know about. You could consider any gods or goddesses as aliens in any religion. So I don't know, like, it just felt like it came so out of left field though that it really caught me off guard, and I don't like it. But basically the ending of this does end with a kind of a happy ending where Sita basically kicks the crap out of Ori, kills him, and saves the baby, and the Setians go off on their merry way knowing that Sita is not someone to be messed with. So that's pretty much the entirety of Evil Thirst. Not as much as I think I had to say about with Phantom. I just felt like this was not the best. I felt like this was, you know, kind of one of those filler stories for a while. I felt with the first big part of this book, I felt like it was going to be just a filler story, and it kind of was. But it felt like a filler story when it was supposed to be kind of the end of this plot line, which, like I said before, is because Kalika died. It's not the entire end of a plot line per se, though, because the baby is still around. There's still a lot going on with, like, wanting to protect him and all of that. But Kalika does die, so we only get to see her in Phantom and in Evil Thirst. And I don't know, I felt like her death was kind of... I would have liked to see her actually live on, because especially when she reveals that her, like, being there and her purpose in being born was so that she could protect this baby with Sita. But there also was, like, no communication of that whatsoever beforehand, because Kalika never, like, basically told any of this to Sita. Sita always just made the assumption that Kalika was evil because Kalika was a bloodthirsty bitch, which she was. And the way that she would be hounding for information about the little baby made Sita believe that Kalika was going to hurt this child. Truthfully, I would have thought the same way, having seen how Kalika acted in this book, in this book and in Phantom. Like, how I don't understand how somebody would not think that Kalika was out to kill this baby based on how she was acting. So I felt like there was just so much miscommunication that happened that could have been so easily resolved if Sita and Kalika had just actually had time to sit down and talk about what was going on, because they never did. In Phantom, Kalika grew up so fast that Sita didn't know what to do. Her head was spinning, and then she sees that Kalika is, like, basically a bloodthirsty animal, and she doesn't know how to control her, and she basically, like, just gives up almost with the whole thing. I feel like this book brought everything down. It brought up a lot of negative things in terms of, like, what I feel like with the story. I like the idea of, you know, there being a reincarnated version of Christ being involved, but I don't feel like Kalika necessarily needed to die. I feel like Seymour, you know, probably at this point deserves to be a vampire. I mean, he's nearly died 3 times. He did die 1 time during Phantom. I don't understand. The aliens thing is still ringing in my head. Where did Pike come up with this shit? Where in this story did it seem like it was a good idea to bring in an alien race that somehow has to do with the religion? Like, is this alien race somehow actually, like, talked about in Hindu mythology? I don't freaking know, but it's like a complete curveball that I just completely swung and missed, and I don't even know. Like, I feel like I'm spinning in the batter's box just trying to, like, figure out what the fuck actually happened here. But I will say that I feel like the overall craft of the story is going better in terms of the writing style. The writing style is getting to be much more concrete, much more where I would like it to be in terms of the overall tone of the story. Sita actually has a little bit more of a relatable tone as opposed to how, like, The Last Vampire was and how Black Blood and Red Dice were. I feel like Phantom, we really kind of hit a stride with the writing style and the tone and the voice of Sita. Like, we really understand now what her voice is, and it's clear. It makes it easier for us to, like, as readers, to, like, understand her and feel like the voice fits the character kind of thing. So there is that. I do also like the fact that Seymour does finally get to become a vampire, because I have been waiting for that for a long time. I was really thinking that in Phantom she was going to make him a vampire, and she didn't. So I am happy to see that he finally becomes a vampire, because it's what he wants. But that does also bring up a question that we kind of had already several times with Ray being turned into a vampire and then Joel later on, whether or not this is going to seriously affect how Sita is viewed in the eyes of Krishna, because this is now the 3rd person she's turned into a vampire, and I don't know how much more grace Krishna could possibly have if, you know, this was something he told her to never do. Like, what are we gonna, what's the consequence with this? I'm interested to know. It was okay. Like I said, it's a 3-star book. I feel like it just wasn't as good as the other ones. I may even drop it to a 2-star, because I feel like that whole alien thing just completely came out of left field, and I don't understand. I'm gonna drop it to 2 stars, because I feel like that whole alien bit just completely ruined the entire story Like, none of it made sense. I also still feel like Sita and Kalika should have been resolved way, way quicker. I feel like a lot of things would have been resolved if they just actually sat down and spoke to each other for more than 5 minutes before wanting to kill each other. If you guys have read up to Evil Thirst, let me know what your guys' thoughts were down in the comments below. Did you think that this ending was kind of just completely out of left field, or did you feel like it actually fits the story? And for those viewers that might actually be involved in Hindu mythology and research on it, if I don't get to the information before you do, let me know down in the comments below if there is any mention of like alien thoughts or like any kind of alien race involved in like the research when it comes to Hindu mythology. So anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys.